So going into more detail about actual design work I've done, as I mentioned in the email, unfortunately, a lot of the nitty-gritty sort of flows and such are actually locked away in my former employer's Google Drive, but I can share with you what's publicly available. It's actually kind of, this may be better actually, because the designs I worked on have actually launched and are live to the public. So I have worked on launched product. This app is called RGS 365. It is a solar energy app or solar energy company. It's like a Domino's pizza tracker for solar energy. So this app allows a customer to call out a solar panel salesperson to their residence, and sort of using this app sort of track the process through that initial sales interaction to pulling financing. We have included an integration with Wells Fargo to actually directly through the app be able to apply for financing through a bank. That took forever, but it's in there. And then sort of follow this process through the technician coming to visit, the permits being pulled, etc. So much like ordering a pizza, you sort of see this bar being filled up as you work your way through the process. So let's launch the app. The first thing I want you to notice once it loads is the bulk of my contribution to this project is actually the UI. This project, in this project, my actual role, by title anyway, was project manager. What actually I was a combination product owner. I spent a lot of time in Jira managing the tickets for this and doing a ton of QA on my own. I was also a UX designer on this. So despite the fact that we had UX resources dedicated to this project, I actually did design some screens and kind of helped in that process. This home screen here, is an example of that. You may actually notice some similarities between this and sort of my portfolio site, sort of the video header, and the reason I worked on this and not our UX design team, it takes a while to ramp up resources in an agency environment. So I just jumped right in. I had sort of the UX guidelines generally sort of defined in terms of color palettes. I did need to create some elements, so that share status button, for instance, is something that I developed and then put into sort of the component library for our designers to work on later. I do want to point out a couple of very subtle but I think important interactions in this that really lend themselves to the overall usability of the product. So in an agency environment, and I assume this is fairly true across the board, you have a team of UX designers, you have a team of developers, and then you have someone generally responsible for sort of knitting the two together. On this project, my UX designers were very focused on creating the screens, which is great, sort of the layout of the screens, the flow, etc. The developers very focused on implementing that to the T using tools like Zeppelin to make sure that the assets are very precisely sort of placed as designed. The thing that not many people were paying attention to and that kind of fell through the cracks was the UI. And that, if I had to define one contribution on this project, it's that. So for instance, keep your eye on the lower taskbar there with the to-do and messages and stuff. I'm going to reload this app. Watch what happens to that to-do. So that to-do, the little notification kind of hopped up and down. That's an interaction that I'm responsible for adding. It adds just a little touch of like delight to sort of the opening screen. It's also an attention getter. So if you have a task to do, that's something that the user immediately should be drawn to. So kind of making that bubble jump up and down. The other thing on this taskbar is notice the subtle animations of the icons. And in addition to that, it may be difficult to see on this tool, but the actual icon and the text flash to white, and then there's like this overlay that I put on that sort of like is like ripples on a pond. It's sort of there's a very brief flash emanating from the center that sort of indicates to the user that they have in fact clicked on something. This the basic idea for this did come from Coco Controls, if you are familiar with that open source library of different interactions. But the actual sort of taking that and prototyping it into sort of what you see before you that's me. The layout of the screen I did mention is me. I just used was using Sketch on this. The very subtle kind of shadow behind that pending task card. The overall sort of aesthetic of this is card based, so you will see a lot of sort of floating cards on these screens. Let's go to okay, so referrals, this is a good one. So referrals, this screen, the actual design of the screen was, actually there wasn't a lot to do for a design perspective. This is all copy that was provided to us by the client, so it's not very usable from a UX perspective. There's some type here that's very, like the legal disclaimer, I guess legalese is always very small. The call to action is great, start now, etc. But the thing I want to call your attention to is what's going on in the header. This is another contribution I had to this. Here, there's a very interesting animation going on that I borrowed this idea from both Twitter. They have some nice sort of UI going on and animations with the header of their home screen, but also the sliding up of the background behind the card is something I took from. There was a snippet I saw, generally similar on Coco Controls that was similar to this. I knit the two together to create this, and to do that, to clearly communicate this idea with my team of developers. My developers were located in India, so this may be a cultural thing. This may be just developers in general. Very, very literal. So you can't say, okay, I want this to slide up and then the text to shrink. If you just give them that vague of direction, which is, you can't expect them to get it right, and generally they don't. So the best way to communicate, especially with distributed teams, is actually showing. So I used a prototyping tool called Origami. It's a Facebook prototyping tool that does a very good job of showing and highlighting those transitions between screens. You can play with like the elasticity values. It's very very precise, and that's where a lot of these prototyping apps fall short. But Origami does a really good job of that. So this interaction with the title shrinking and that background kind of coming up in line with the shift of the title up to the top, that's an example of a piece of interaction that I contributed to this project. A lot of these, so more of this, borrowing from the sort of the overlay sort of bursting out from the center. Notice on this more screen, sort of a similar sort of white overlay sort of spreading out to indicate that the user has selected something. I could go into so much more detail with this app. Actually, going through this is giving me borderline PTSD. This project was the most difficult project I've ever worked on and tremendously complex. I wish I had the UX flows to show you. This app, what we're seeing right here is just the app for the resident. So as a resident, this is what I see. There's a Android and an iOS version for this. There are also 7 other apps that were part of this project that all fell under my umbrella. So I not only had to master the product you see before you, but also a similar product for the salespeople and how they manage their back-end flows. A similar product for the technician, the guy who actually installs it, with added capabilities like taking pictures of the actual installation and stuff. Then you have web apps for the administrators and the back-end people who are managing this at the company. This was tremendously complex, and again, I apologize, I don't have a lot of the actual working assets from this project, but at least this helps get you a good idea of sort of at least the level of detail and capability from a UX perspective I'm able to contribute.